Good morning. We are ready for the third segment of Nancy Drew's Hidden Staircase Mystery. This is book 2 in the series. And so on this rainy day here in Southwest Missouri, we are going to start on chapter 7. Now, if you'll remember, Nancy and her friend Helen are staying at Helen's great-grandmother and great-aunt's home that they say has suddenly become haunted, even though the family has owned the home for centuries, literally. So let's see what happens. Within 5 seconds of reaching the second floor, Nancy could hear that the violin playing had stopped. She raced into Miss Flora's room, from which the sounds had seemed to come. The radio was not on. She felt of it to see if it were even slightly warm, to prove that it had been in use. But it wasn't. She told herself. The music wasn't being played on this. As Nancy dashed across the room, she almost ran into Helen. "What'd you find out?" "Nothing, so far," Nancy replied as she raced into Aunt Rosemary's room to check the bedside radio there. But it was cool to the touch as well. She and Helen stood in the center of the room, puzzling frowns creasing their forehead. "There was music, wasn't there?" Helen asked her friend. "Yes, I heard it. We all did," Nancy replied. "But where did it come from? Who put a record on the record player or turned on a hidden radio?" "Helen, I'm positive an intruder comes into this mansion by some secret entrance and tries to frighten us all." "Well, they succeed," Helen answered. "It's positively eerie." "And dangerous," Nancy added. "Let's continue our search right after breakfast tomorrow," Helen said. "We will," Nancy agreed. "But in the meantime, I believe Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary, to say nothing of ourselves, need a little police protection." Helen agreed. "Let's go downstairs and suggest it." The girls returned to the first floor, and Nancy told Mrs. Hayes and her mother of the failure to find the cause of the violin music, but what she had in mind. "Oh dear, the police will only laugh at us," Miss Flora objected. "Mother," Rosemary said, "the captain and his men didn't believe us before because they thought we were imagining things. But Nancy and Helen heard the music at 2 different times, and they saw the chandelier rock as well. I'm sure that they're going to believe Nancy and Helen and send a guard out here." "I won't ask the captain to believe in a ghost or even hunt for one," Nancy agreed and smiled at Miss Flora. "But I think we should request at the moment is that we have a man on patrol here at the grounds at night. I'm sure that we're perfectly safe while we're all awake. But I have to admit I'm going to be a little uneasy about going to bed, wondering what the ghost may do next." Miss Flora finally agreed to the plan, and Nancy went to telephone Captain Rosslyn, who readily agreed to send a man out a little later. "He'll return each night as long as you need him," she was told, "and I'll tell him not to ring the bell to tell you when he comes. So, if anyone is there who breaks into the mansion by secret entrance, they would not know that there was a guard on duty." "I understand and think that is a wonderful plan," Nancy agreed. So, when Miss Flora, her daughter, and the 2 girls went to bed, they were confident they would have a restful night. Nancy felt that if there was no disturbance, then it would indicate that the ghost's means into Twin Elms was directly from the outside. That means, she thought to herself, when the guard is on duty, they didn't dare come inside the house. The young detective's desire for a good night's sleep was rudely thwarted when she was awakened about midnight. Nancy was sure she'd heard a noise. But the house was quiet now. Nancy kept listening intently and finally got out of bed. "Perhaps the noise I heard came from outdoors," she told herself. Tiptoeing to a window so that she would not awaken Helen in the bed next to her, Nancy peered out the window onto the moonlit grounds. Shadows from the tree branches swayed in the breeze, and moving back and forth. But then, and even a scent from the roses in the rose garden drifted up to Nancy. "Oh, it's heavenly," she thought. But suddenly Nancy gave a start. A figure had darted from behind a tree toward a clump of bushes. Was he the guard or the ghost? Nancy wondered. As Nancy watched intently to see if she would see any further movement, she heard padding footsteps in the hall, and suddenly a knock at the door. "Nancy, Nancy, wake up, come quick." It was Miss Flora's voice, and she sounded extremely frightened. Nancy darted across the room, unlocked the door, and opened it, and by this time Helen was awake as well and out of bed. "What happened?" she asked sleepily. Aunt Rosemary had now come into the hall also. Her mother did not say a word, but just started back toward her bedroom. The others followed, wondering what they would find. Moonlight brightened part of the room, but the area near the hall was dark. "There, up there," Miss Flora pointed. Two burning eyes looked down on the watchers. Instantly, Nancy snapped on the light, and they gazed up at a large brown owl perched on an old-fashioned picture molding. "Oh, how did that get in here?" The others did not answer at once. Then Nancy, not wishing to frighten Miss Flora, remarked casually, "Oh, probably down the chimney." "But," Helen started to say, Nancy gave her friend a wink, and Helen didn't finish the sentence. Nancy was sure Helen was going to say that the damper had been closed and that the bird couldn't possibly have flown into the room through the chimney. But turning back to Miss Flora, Nancy asked whether or not her bedroom door had been locked. "Oh, yes," the elderly woman insisted. "I wouldn't leave it unlocked for anything nowadays." Nancy did not comment. Knowing that Miss Flora was a bit forgetful, she thought it was possible that the door had not been locked. An intruder had entered, let the owl fly to the picture frame, then made just enough noise to wake the sleeping woman. To satisfy her own memory about the damper, Nancy went over to the fireplace and looked inside, and it was closed. But if the door to the hall was locked, she thought to herself, then the ghost had to come in some other way and escape the detection of the guard. "I don't want that owl in here all night," Miss Flora broke into Nancy's thoughts. "We've got to get it out." "That's not going to be easy," Aunt Rosemary spoke up. "Owls have very sharp claws and beaks. They don't hesitate to use them viciously on anyone who wants to disturb them. Mother, you come and sleep in my room the rest of the night. We'll chase the owl out in the morning." Nancy urged Miss Flora to agree to that, and said, "I'll stay here and try getting Mr. Owl out of the house. But do you have a pair of old heavy gloves?" "Oh, I have some in my room," Aunt Rosemary replied. "They're very thick leather. I use them for gardening, especially in the rose garden." She went back to her room and returned shortly, bringing the gloves to Nancy, who put them on at once, then suggested Aunt Rosemary and Miss Flora leave. Nancy smiled. "Helen and I'll take over Operation Owl." As the door closed behind the two women, Nancy dragged a chair to the corner of the room beneath the bird. She was counting on the fact that the bright overhead light had dulled his vision, and she'd be able to grab it without too much trouble. "Helen, will you open one of the screens, please, and wish me luck?" "Don't let that thing loose," Helen warned as she unfastened the screen and held it out. Nancy reached up, and by stretching as far as she could, was just able to grasp the bird. In a lightning movement, she put her two hands around the body and imprisoned its claws, but all at once the owl began to bob its head and peck at her arms above the glove. Wincing in pain, she stepped down from the chair and ran as fast as she could across the room. The bird, squirming and darting its beak first in one direction and then another, was grazing Nancy's arms continually, but she managed to hold the owl that most of its pecking missed its goal of her arms. She held the bird out the window and released it and stepped back. Helen closed the screen as quickly as she could and fastened it. "Oh," Nancy gazed ruefully at her wrist, which now showed several bloody digs from the owl. "I'm glad that's over." "Oh, I am too. Let's lock Miss Flora's door from the outside so that the ghost can't bring in any more owls to the rest of us." Suddenly, Helen grabbed Nancy's arms. "I just thought of something. There's supposed to be a police guard outside, yet the ghost got in here unseen. Either that, or there's a secret entrance to this mansion which runs underground, probably to one of the outbuildings on the property." Nancy now told about the figure she had seen dart from behind the tree. "I've got to find out right away if it was the ghost or the guard. I'll do a little snooping. It's possible the guard didn't show up. But if he did, and if he's any good, then he'll find me." "All right," said Helen, "but Nancy, please be careful. You're taking awful chances to solve this mystery." Nancy laughed as she walked back to the girls' bedroom, dressed quickly, and then went downstairs, put the back door key in her pocket, and let herself out the house. Stealthily she went down the stairs and glided to a spot of some back of the bushes. Seeing no one around, she came from behind them and ran across the lawn to a maple tree. She stood among the shadows for several moments, then darted out toward a building which in colonial times was used as the kitchen. Halfway there, she heard a sound behind her and turned. A man stood in the shadows not 10 feet away. Quick as a wink, one hand flew up to a holster on his hip. "Halt!" he commanded. Nancy halted, as directed, and stood facing the man. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm the police guard, miss. Just call me Patrick. But who are you?" Quickly, Nancy explained that she then asked to see his identification. He opened his coat, pulled out a leather case, and showed the shield proving that he was a policeman. His name, Tom Patrick. "Have you seen anyone else prowling around?" "Not a soul, miss. This place has been quieter than a cemetery." When the young sleuth told him about the fugitive figure she'd seen from the window, he laughed. "I think that was me. I guess I'm not so good at hiding as I thought." Nancy laughed back. "Anyway, you soon nabbed me," she told him. They chatted for several minutes, and Tom Patrick told Nancy that the people in Cliffwood regarded Miss Turnbull as a little strange. They said that if she thought her house was haunted, it was all in line with the stories of the odd people who had lived there from time to time during the past 100 years or so. "Would this rumor make the property difficult to sell?" Nancy asked the detective. "Certainly would," he answered. Nancy said she thought the whole thing was a shame. Miss Turnbull is one of the loveliest women I've ever met, and there's nothing the matter with her, except that once in a while she is a bit forgetful." "You don't think that some of these happenings we've heard about are imagination?" Tom Patrick asked. "No, I don't," Nancy replied definitely. Then she told him about the owl. The door was locked, every screen was fastened, and the damper in the chimney was closed. "Now, you tell me how it got in there," she said. His eyes opened wide. "You say this happened only a little while ago?" Nancy nodded. "Of course I can't be everywhere on the grounds at once, but I've been round and round the building. I've never stopped walking since I arrived. I don't see how anyone could have gotten inside the mansion without me seeing him." "I'll tell you my theory," Nancy replied. "I believe there's an underground entrance from somewhere on the grounds. It may be in one of the outbuildings. Anyway, tomorrow morning I'm searching for it." "Well, I wish you luck," Tom Patrick said, "and if anything happens during the night, I'll let you know." Nancy pointed to the window on the second floor. "That's my room. If you don't have a chance to use the door knocker, throw a stone up against the screen. I'll wake up. I know I will." The guard promised to do just that, and Nancy went back to the mansion, climbed the stairs for the second time that night, and got undressed and back in bed. Helen was already back to sleep, so Nancy crawled into her bed noiselessly. The two girls woke up the next morning about the same time, and immediately Helen asked for details of what Nancy had learned outdoors. After hearing how her friend had been stopped by the guard, she shivered. "Nancy, you could have been in real danger, not knowing who he was. You must be more careful. Suppose that man had been the ghost?" Nancy laughed but made no reply, and the girls went downstairs and started to fix breakfast. In a few minutes, Aunt Rosemary and Miss Flora joined them. "Did you find anything more last night?" Miss Hayes asked Nancy. "Only that the police guard's name is Tom Patrick," Nancy answered. As soon as breakfast was over, she decided to announce that she was going to investigate all the outbuildings. "I'm searching for an underground passage leading to the mansion. I believe that it's possible that while we hear no hollow sounds when we tap the walls, it's because there are double doors or walls where the entrance is." Aunt Rosemary looked at Nancy intently. "You really are a good detective, Nancy. I see now why Helen wanted to ask you to help us find our ghost." Nancy's eyes twinkled. "I may have some instinct for sleuthing," she said, "but unless I can solve this mystery, it's not going to do any of us any good." Then turning to Helen, she suggested they put on the old clothes that they had brought with them. So, in sports shirts and jeans, the girls left the house. Nancy led the way first to the old ice house. She rolled back the creaking door and gazed in. The tall, narrow building was about 10 feet square. On one side was a series of sliding doors, one above the other. "I've heard Miss Flora say," Helen said, "that in days gone by huge blocks of ice were cut from the river when it was frozen over, dragged here on a sledge, and the blocks were stored here and taken off from the top down through these various doors. That story rather rules out the possibility of any underground passage leading from this building. I presume that there was ice in here most of the year." The floor was covered with sawdust, and although Nancy was sure she would find nothing of interest beneath it, she decided to take a look. Seeing an old rusted shovel in the corner, she picked it up and began to dig through the sawdust. But there was only dirt beneath. "Well, that clue fizzled out," Helen remarked as she and Nancy started for the next building. The next one had been used as a smokehouse. It, too, had a dirt floor. In one corner was a small fireplace where smoldering fires of hickory wood had once burned continually. The smoke curled up a narrow chimney to the second floor, which was windowless. Rows and rows of hunks of meat hung up there on hooks to be smoked, Helen explained, and days later it was turned into delicious hams and bacon. There was no indication of a secret opening in that building either, so Nancy went outside the small 2-story peaked roof structure and walked around. Up one side of the brick building, and leading to a door above, were the remnants of a ladder. Now only the side piece, which had held the rungs, remained. "Give me a boost, will you, Helen?" Nancy requested. "I want to have a look inside." Helen squatted on the ground, and Nancy climbed onto her shoulders. Helen braced her hands against the wall, straightened up, and Nancy opened the half-rotted wooden door. "Nope, no ghost in here," she announced, and Nancy jumped to the ground and started for the servants' quarters. But a thorough inspection of the brick and wood structure failed to reveal any clue to a secret passageway there either. Only one outbuilding left, which Helen said was the old carriage house. This was built of brick and was fairly large. No carriages stood on its wooden floor, but around the walls hung old harnesses and reins. Nancy paused a moment to examine one of the bridles. It was set with 2 hand-painted medallions of women's portraits. Suddenly her reflection was interrupted by a scream. Turning, she was just in time to see Helen plunge through a hole in the floor. In a flash, Nancy was across the carriage house and looking down into the hole where the rotted floor had given way. "Helen!" she cried out. I'm all right. Nice and soft down here, but please, can you throw me your flashlight?" Nancy removed the flashlight from the pocket of her jeans and tossed it down. "I thought maybe I could see something down here, but this is just a plain old hole. Give me a hand up, will you?" Nancy lay flat on the floor and with one arm grabbed a supporting beam that stood in the center of the carriage house. Reaching down with the other arm, she assisted Helen to climb back up. "We'd better watch our step around here," Nancy said as her friend once more stood beside her. "You're right about that," Helen agreed. Helen's plunge, though, had given Nancy an idea that there might be other openings in the floor, and that one of them could be an entrance to an underground passage. But though she flashed her light on every inch of the carriage house floor, she discovered nothing. "Let's quit. I'm a mess, and I'm hungry." "All right," Nancy agreed. "Are you game to search the cellar this afternoon?" "Oh, sure," she said. After lunch, they started to investigate the storerooms in the cellar. There was a cool stone room where barrels of apples had once been kept, and another formerly filled with bags of wheat flour, barley, buckwheat, and oatmeal. "And everything was grown here on the estate?" Nancy asked. "Yes," Helen said. "Oh, it must have been perfectly wonderful. I wish we could go back in time and see how life was in those days." "Maybe if we could, we'd know how that ghost got in here," Helen remarked. Nancy thought so too, and as the girls went from room to room in the cellar, Nancy beamed her flashlight over every inch of the wall and floor. At times her pulse would quicken when she thought she'd discovered a trap door or secret opening, but every time she had to admit failure. There was no evidence of either one in the cellar. "Well, this has been a discouraging day," Nancy remarked, sighing, "but I'm not giving up." Helen felt sorry for Nancy, and to cheer her up, she said, "Storeroom after storeroom, but no room to store a ghost." Nancy had to laugh at her friend's joke, and together they climbed back up the stairway to the kitchen. After changing clothes, they helped Aunt Rosemary prepare a dinner for the evening, and when the group had eaten and later gathered in the parlor, Nancy reminded the others that she had expected her father to arrive the next day. "Dad didn't want me to bother meeting him, but I just can't wait to see him. I think I'll meet all the trains from Chicago that stop here." "I hope your father will stay a day or two," Miss Flora spoke up. "Surely he'll have some idea about the ghost." "Good ones, too," Nancy assured her. "If he's on the early train, he'll have breakfast with us. I'll meet it at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Later that evening, Nancy's plans were suddenly changed because Hannah Gruen telephoned to say a man at the telegraph office had called the house a short time to read a message from Mr. Drew. He had been unavoidably detained and would not arrive on Wednesday. "In the telegram, your father said that he will let us know when he will arrive," the housekeeper added. "Oh, I'm disappointed," Nancy told her, "but I hope this delay means Dad's on the trail of Willie Wharton." "Speaking of Willie Wharton," said Hannah, "I heard something about him today." "What?" Nancy asked. "That he's been seen down by the river, right here in River Heights a couple of days ago." "You say Willie Wharton was seen in River Heights down by the river?" Nancy asked unbelievingly. "Yes. I learned it from our postman, Mr. Ritter, who's one of the people that sold property to the railroad. As you know, Mr. Ritter's very honest and reliable, Nancy, and he said he'd heard that some of the property owners were trying to horn in on the deal of Willie Wharton of getting more money, but Mr. Ritter won't have anything to do with it. He calls it a hold-up." "Did Mr. Ritter see Willie Wharton himself?" Nancy asked eagerly. "No, one of the other property owners told him Willie was around." "That man could be mistaken," Nancy suggested. "Well, of course, that's possible," Hannah agreed, "and I'm inclined to think he is. If your father's staying over in Chicago, it must be because of Willie Wharton." Nancy did not tell Helen what was racing through her mind. She said good night cheerfully, but actually she was very worried. Maybe Willie Wharton was down by the river, and maybe Dad was unavoidably detained by an enemy of his connection with the railroad bridge project. One of the dissatisfied property owners may have followed him to Chicago. Or if it was not inconceivable that Mr. Drew had found Willie Wharton only to have Willie hold him prisoner. As Nancy sat lost in worried thought, Helen came into the hall. "Is something the matter?" she asked. "I don't know," Nancy replied, "but I have a feeling there is. Dad telegraphed to say that he wouldn't be here tomorrow. Instead of wiring, he always phones me or Hannah, or has his office do it when he's away. And it seems strange that that's not what he did this time." "You told me a few days ago that your father had been threatened," said Helen. "Are you afraid something's happened?" "Yes, I am." "Is there anything I can do?" Helen offered. "Oh, thank you, Helen. I appreciate that, but I don't think so. There isn't anything I can do either. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens. Maybe I'll hear from Dad again soon." Nancy looked so sad and worried that Helen searched her mind to find something to cheer her friend up, and suddenly she had an idea and went to speak to Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary. "Oh, I think that's a wonderful plan, if Nancy'll do it," Aunt Rosemary said. Helen called Nancy in from the hallway and proposed that they go to the attic to look for the big trunk of old costumes. "We might even put some of them on," Miss Flora proposed, smiling girlishly. "And you girls could dance the minuet," said Miss Rosemary enthusiastically. "Mother plays the spinet very well. Maybe she'd play for you." "I love the idea," said Nancy. She knew that the three were trying to lift her spirits, and she appreciated. Besides, what they were proposing sounded like a lot of fun. So all of them trooped up the creaky stairs to the attic, but in their haste none of the group had remembered to bring flashlights. "I'll go down and get a couple," Nancy offered. "Never mind," Aunt Rosemary spoke up. "There are some candles and holders right here. We keep them here for emergencies." She lit 2 white candles, which stood in the old-fashioned saucer-type brass holders, and led the way over to the costume trunk. As Helen lifted the lid, Nancy exclaimed in delight, "Oh, how beautiful! She could see silk and satin and lace dresses all along one side of the trunk. At the other end, folded up, was a rose velvet robe. She and Helen lifted out the garments and held them up. "They're lovelier than the formal clothes we wear to dances these days," Helen remarked. "The men's are especially nice." Miss Flora smiled, "and a lot more flattering." The entire trunk was unpacked before the group selected what they would wear. "The pale green silk gown with the panniers would look lovely on you, Nancy," Miss Flora said, "and I'm sure it's just your size." Nancy surveyed the tiny waist. "I'll try," she said, "but I'll probably have to hold my breath and then some to close it up, especially in the middle. My, but the women in olden times certainly had slim waistlines." Helen was holding up a man's purple velvet suit. It had knee breeches and a waistcoat and a lace front ruffled shirt. There was even a tricorn hat and long white stockings and buckled slippers to complete the costume. "I think I'll wear this to be your partner, Nancy," Helen laughed. Taking off her pumps, she slid her feet into the slippers, and the others laughed aloud. A man with a foot twice the size of Helen's had once worn these. "Oh, never mind. I'll stuff the empty space with paper," Helen said. Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary selected gowns for themselves, then opened a good-sized box at the bottom of the trunk that contained various kinds of wigs worn in colonial times. All were pure white and fluffy. It was amazing that they had been preserved so well after so many years. Carrying the costumes and wigs, the group descended down to their bedrooms, where they changed into the fancy clothes, then went to the first floor. Miss Flora led the way into the room across the hall from the parlor. She said it had once been what was called the drawing room. Later it had become a library, but the old spinet still stood in the corner. Miss Flora sat down and began to play Beethoven's Minuet. Aunt Rosemary sat beside her. Nancy and Helen, dubbed by the latter Master and Mistress Colonial America, began to dance. They clasped their right hands high in the air, then took 2 steps backward, made a little bow, then circled, strutted, and even put in a few steps which no dancers in colonial times would have known. Aunt Rosemary giggled and clapped. "I wish President Washington would come to see you," she said, acting her part in the entertainment. "Mistress Nancy, pray thee do encore, and Master Corning, wilt thou accompany the fair lady?" The girls started giggling. Helen made a low bow to her aunt, her tricorn in her hand, and said, "At your service, my dear lady." The minuet was repeated. Then Miss Flora stopped playing and the girls sat down. "Oh, that was wonderful fun," said Nancy. "Something I'd like to—" "Listen," she commanded suddenly. From outside the house they could hear a loud shouting. "Come here, you in the house! Come here!" Nancy and Helen dashed from their chairs to the front door. Nancy snapped on the porch light and the 2 girls raced outside. "Over here!" a man's voice urged. Nancy and Helen ran down the stairs and out on the lawn, and just ahead of them stood Tom Patrick. In a vice-like grip he was holding a thin, bent-over man whom the girls judged to be about 50 years of age. "Is this your ghost?" His prisoner was struggling to free himself, but was unable to get loose. The girls hurried forward to look at the man. "I caught him sneaking around the edge of the grounds." "Let me go!" the man cried angrily. "I'm no ghost." "What are you talking about?" "You may not be a ghost," the detective said, "but you could be a thief who has been robbing this house." "What? I'm no thief. I live around here. Anyone'll tell you I'm okay." "What's your name, and where do you live?" the detective prodded. He let the man stand up, but held one of his arms firmly. "My name's Albert Watson, and I live over on Tuttle Road." "What are you doing on this property?" Albert Watson said he'd been taking a short cut home. His wife had taken their car for the evening. "I've been to a friend's house. You can call him and verify what I'm saying, and you can call my wife, too. Maybe she's home now, and she'll come and get me." The guard reminded Albert Watson that he had not revealed why he was sneaking around the ground. "Well, it was because of you. I'd heard round town there was a detective patrolling the place, and I didn't want to bump into you. I'm afraid that what happened would." The man relaxed a little. "I guess you're a pretty good guard, at least." Detective Patrick let go of Albert Watson's arm. "Your story sounds okay, but we're going into the house to do some telephoning to find out if you're telling the truth." "You'll find out, all right. I'm even a notary public. They don't give out a notary license to dishonest folks." Then he stared at Nancy and Helen. "What are you doing all dressed in those funny clothes?" We were having a costume party," Helen responded. In the excitement, she and Nancy had forgotten what they were wearing. The two guards started for the house with the men following, and when Mr. Watson and the guards saw Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary also in costume, they gazed at them in amusement. Nancy introduced Mr. Watson. Miss Flora said she knew of him, although she had never met him. 2 telephone calls by the guard confirmed Mr. Watson's story. In a little while his wife arrived to drive her husband home, and Detective Patrick went back to his guard duty. Aunt Rosemary then turned out all the lights on the first floor, and she and Miss Flora and the girls went upstairs. Bedroom doors were locked, and everyone hoped that there would be no more disturbances during the night. "It was a good day, Nancy," said Helen, yawning. "Yes, it was. Of course, I'm a little disappointed that we aren't further along in solving the mystery, but maybe by this time tomorrow." She looked toward Helen, who did not answer, because she was already sound asleep. Nancy herself was under the cover a few minutes later, and as she lay staring at the ceiling, going over the events of the last 2 days, her mind recalled the scene in the attic where they were pulling the costumes from the old trunk. She suddenly gave a start. That section of wall, back of the trunk, the paneling looked different. It was different than the rest of the attic. Maybe it's movable and leads to a secret exit. Tomorrow, I'm going to find out. Okay, that is where we're going to leave off for today, but we're going to find out what they see in the attic the next time we come together.